Bestiary, which they have up at the front counter if any of you guys are interested. And the second book is titled Familiars in Witchcraft. And they're both really explorations of similar themes, mostly extensions of the human family and our ancestry, which I think a lot of people really don't know the story of where human beings came from or how it is we have come to be in this situation that we're in now. So I'm a person that likes to explore and research into ideas and themes of what a human is and how exactly we have found ourselves in this state of being that we currently reside in. When you go into explorations of where human beings come from, you find a lot of very crazy stories from all over the earth. And even scientists find that they don't really have very good answers to a lot of these questions. There's a lot of theories about how we've come to be in this state of knowing with all of our technology, countries, things around us, languages, things that most of us take for granted every day. But I'm a person that sees things and I ask a lot of questions. So I'm always like, wait, what is this? So my books really stem from the result of a lot of questions that I ask about how things come to be. The Witch's Bestiary really is an exploration into the mythological creatures that most of you are probably familiar with. We learn about most of them when we're children. Things like unicorns and dragons, griffins, werewolves, all of these kinds of things. And we're very familiar with modern stories about these creatures. What I discovered in a lot of my research is that the stories of these mythological creatures are, for the most part, codes that are used to discuss certain behaviors in human beings and also nature. So if, for example, we look at humanity's stories of the unicorn, a lot of people will take for granted a face value presentation that this is talking about a real animal that existed on the earth that was a horse that had a horn on it. But if you look at a lot of the esoteric and occult literature, it's actually talking about a state of mental acuity that human beings can accomplish. So I don't debate whether or not it actually was a real creature, but if you look at the alchemical material, a unicorn is a description of a trick that you can do with your brain. How many of you guys are familiar with that? None of you. This is what really inspired me to write the book, because no one's aware of these secret codes that these creatures represent. What do you guys think a dragon is? A lizard that is of enormous size that lived on the earth? This is a very plausible explanation because there have been lizards of enormous size that have lived on the earth, right? So we had dinosaurs. But if you look at a lot of the descriptions of dragons throughout esoteric and indigenous cultures, dragons also, strangely enough, represent an ability of human beings to do something with their minds. How many of you guys have ever heard of that before? Are you guys aware of what the word dragon means and the word's etymology? It's pretty good. It comes from, arguably, right? There's a lot of people that debate about all of these things because human beings really like to argue about things and what they mean. That's one of our favorite things to do with each other. But if you look at the word etymology for dragon, a lot of it goes to a word that comes from Derek's thigh, which means to see. And it has to do with a certain kind of vision and a way that you can see things with your eyeballs. A way that the majority of human beings have forgotten the way to see with dragon eyes that the esoteric occultists knew about and indigenous people. It's nice that Brooke is here because she knows what I'm talking about. So there's actually ways that you can see the world by engaging your vision that changes your reality and what you can perceive. And this is what the mythologies of the dragons were trying to communicate to people, which very few people are aware of anymore. With the unicorns and the focus on the point of the horn, they were trying to communicate a process in Mercury, which was about stilling or fixing Mercury. If you read in a lot of the scientific or alchemical material, they talk about the fixation of Mercury. Are any of you guys familiar with alchemy at all? It's very popular in New Age talky talk, but I haven't really met anyone that would know what I'm talking about right now. They just say like as above, so below is kind of the famous. How many of you guys have heard as above, so below? Okay, so you guys are all familiar with that catchphrase, right? But you are unfamiliar with the term fixation of Mercury. What do you guys think that might be talking about? Do you know what Mercury? Thing near Mercury, it's going to have an interaction with it and it's going to react to it. It's very volatile. So there's some metals that if you put something next to it, they don't really care. Like they're very relaxed and they don't mind that there's something else coming into contact with them. Gold is very famously a very unreactive metal, so it's chill, right? If you put another metal near gold, it doesn't really care that there's something touching it. But if you put anything near Mercury, it has a total hissy fit and it cannot stand that there's something in the vicinity of the Mercury, and it's going to become very volatile and it's going to attack it and it's going to have a chemical interaction with it. Does that make sense? So in the alchemical material, Mercury represents the nature of mind and how our mind operates. Mind is very volatile. How many of you guys have experienced some of the volatility of mind? It doesn't like other things that are foreign. It pushes them away and it interacts with them and it attacks them. It's very liquid and fluid. It's very difficult to get it still. How many of you guys have ever accomplished getting your mind to sit still for even a few moments? Pretty difficult task to engage in. You can try holding a stillness of mind and kind of try a little contest with yourself and see how long you can make it last, and you'll find out how difficult it is. So the unicorn in the alchemical material, as I talk about in my book, was about what can happen to you when you spend predominant amounts of time fixing your Mercury or stabilizing your Mercury and stilling and binding your mind. It creates something new that emerges from it that you can only discover through the action of doing this practice. And this sadly is why no one knows what that symbolism is talking about, because they're not engaging in these practices anymore. So people just ascribe a meaning to it without any knowledge of what that is because they're not doing it. So most of the mythologies of the beasts, which were intertwined with these secrets or codes, have been completely taken away, and people have ascribed other meaning to them, and they've become kind of like a joke. So it's like a broken telephone game, and this is how most of the occult material has ended up, right? You'll see most people who think of the word occult even, and they'll think, of course, of pentagrams and candles and, you know, witches with boobs wearing like red outfits and things like this. But that's really all people know that the occult is, right? This is a tragedy that has been caused through ignorance and the removal of the meaning of the material, right? So people's minds then have created and constructed all of these meanings that they think it is, but they really are not that at all. So a lot of my attempts are to try to go back into the sources, original sources of material, because what you'll find, for example, even when researching mythological beasts, that everyone was saying the same thing over and over. If you go on the interwebs, this is a tragic occurrence that happens on a daily basis, especially now that algorithms and artificial intelligence are being implemented, where everything is simply cut and pasted and copied from an earlier source, but there's no discerning intellect that is curating the material, right? So people think, oh, well, here's this thing that says this, so that it must be this. But then they won't check on the source of the fake news, right? So we can see how this happens. The internet is a great example of how things like this get spread, where people get an incorrect idea of what a meaning of something is, because it's essentially like fake news. But this is not just a condition of the internet. This is a phenomenon of human mind. And communication in general. This is a serious issue that we'll be confronted with on major levels as we enter into new echelons of these technologies that are very good at presenting things as if they're true. Okay? So going back into these esoteric and early sources to try to find what truth is gives us an advantage at learning what is called discernment. Discernment is how you know shit from Shinola. If you're presented with something, how many of you feel confident that you would be able to tell whether something was true or false? How many of you feel confident that you could tell me if any data, fact, or even object that I presented, say an image of to you, was true or false, real or unreal? Do you guys see how this could present a serious issue? This is an issue that we're currently presented with on very large levels. The learning of discernment is tied into a lot of these esoteric and occult traditions because they felt that each individual must be guided to be able to discern what is true and what is not true. There are ways that your physical body is able to do this for you, even if you feel like you don't have a mental ability to intellectually logic out what's true and untrue, because often this is not very reliable either. Your ability to intellectually discern the truth of something is entirely dependent on your data source, right? This presents an awfully large limitation for most of us because our minds are limited and how much data we can take in is limited, and you're mostly going to seek data from biased sources that probably agree with what you think about something. This is an inherent need in people because we like to be liked and we don't want to think that we're wrong. So we like to just seek out data that's going to agree with what's called our biases, right? So this is how a lot of disinformation and fake news, aka gossip, is spread like plagues and wildfire throughout the minds of the general populace of humanity. The good news is that people have known how to tell truth from lies for a really long time. Your survival used to depend on you being able to tell what was true and what was false. So this was a primal instinct level event, being able to discern what is true from what is not true. However, most human beings are so disremoved and disconnected from their instinctual nature that they're no longer able to feel what true feels like. Do you guys remember a time when someone told you a truth and you felt that that was true, that feeling? Most of the time, when I feel it, feels like goosebumps. So you can feel it on your skin. Like if somebody says a truth, and that hits like a resonance field within your physical body, you're gonna get like the shiver shakes. Me and my friend call it the wash because it's like a rain that comes down over your entire body and you feel it like dong, right? It's like an arrow that hits a mark and you're like, oh, that's true. And you feel it physically in your physical body. No one needs to tell you that that was true. You understand that that is an inherent truth. They also call these things self-evident truths, right? So the good news is there are things that are true that you can tell simply by feeling, right? Coming into contact with these primal, instinctual natures of ourselves is what predominantly the stories of the mythological beasts were trying to communicate to humanity. So most of the beasts contain a key or secret to one of your primal ancestral urges through our connection to animals and nature. This is also a huge focus of the Familiars and Witchcraft book that I wrote as well, which is why we have connections to animals and to natural entities such as trees or rocks, or that you can have a connection to a river or a place like a city or land in general, where I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but you can go to a location on the earth and you can feel an affinity for that particular location. Has that ever happened to you guys? Because there is a spirit in that land itself that has an affinity or resonance to you. Just like a friend. It's like friends. And the word, I know it's that simple though. The word familiar, how many of you guys have ever heard that word used? It's kind of like you always see it in Halloween, right? Everyone has seen the witch with her black cat. That's what it's been reduced to through the broken telephone of the ages, right? So most of you, everybody knows the witch and the black cat, and that there's some kind of relationship with witches and black cats apparently, but not many people know the origin of that story either. Where do you guys think that came from? Have any of you guys heard that story? No, boo. But you all see the witch with her black cat on Halloween, which is coming up shortly. In my research in the book, one of the things that I mention is actually a very tragic tale filled with murder and intrigue. The affiliation of witches and in general pagans with black cats comes from the Christian takeover of the pagan religion. So in Egypt, it was very fashionable to have pet cats if you worshipped the goddess Bast. Have you guys ever heard of the goddess Bast? She was a cat goddess and has been in several movies where people will discuss her. But she's one of the forms of the divine feminine or the goddess. And she was worshipped all over Egypt by the pagans. And when Emperor Theodosius from the Catholic Church entered into Alexandria in later Egypt and then most of Europe to spread the Catholic Church, if anyone had a pet cat, that was to tell that they were a pagan and were worshiping the pagan religion. And there was a law set forward that this was forbidden upon pain of death. So the reason that cats in general, or black cats, were considered unlucky is because if you were caught with one, you were promptly murdered. And in fact, Emperor Theodosius managed to so successfully murder the pagans of Egypt that no one even spoke the language anymore. Do you guys know that they forgot what all of the hieroglyphs meant until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone by Napoleon Bonaparte in the 1700s? So it was so successfully eradicated by the Christian church that the language itself was lost until the 1700s. So this occurred around 300 BC was when all the cat keepers were put down. You were not permitted to have any statues of any of the idols of the gods that the pagans worshipped either. So if you were caught with either a statue or a cat, you were considered a heretic, and so punishment was death. But they don't really include that story. And then later in Europe, there was a papal bull by Pope John Paul the something or other. I can't remember, there were so many of them. maybe, I'm not going to guess. But if you look at the papal bull, it was forbidden also to keep cats because they were considered demonic and of witches and satanic. And this was actually put into law, if you can imagine. And people in Europe were forbidden from keeping cats too. And there's a lot of scholars who did research that discovered that the eradication of pet cats was actually what led to the spread of the plague, and ended up murdering a whole lot of other people too through this kind of discernment. But nonetheless, witches keep cats anyway. They couldn't stop it. So we just kept keeping cats regardless. But the point of the animal familiar spirit, which P.S. was also used later in America in the witch trials, if you kept cats, that meant that you were a witch, so you also were murdered. They just really like to do that to all of the people that kept cats. So really a bummer, right? So the point of it, though, is that they were mostly human beings who had connections, emotional friendships, and relationships to animals and many other sentient life forms that we share our planet with. So most of these individuals who are able to form emotional connections to other life forms other than human, you would think that would happen way more often, wouldn't you? Needs to happen a lot more often, that we're able to sentiently connect with other life forms that we share the planet Earth with. We can't really just keep disconnecting from the entire biosphere that we're living in. So it's kind of weird that people don't do it more often. I highly encourage you to look upon other living beings that we're sharing the planet with as sentient friends that you can form friendly relationships with. But for those of you that have had pets, it is pretty clear that you can really form a deep understanding and relationship with them, right? Like, that's not a big leap to make, or to witness the sentient intelligence and understanding that you can get from your pet, right? How many of you guys feel like your pet knows what you're saying, maybe what you're thinking, your intention, when you're gonna get home? There's a lot of weird things that they seem to just know. The reason that they know all this stuff about you is because you have a connection to them. And this connection, although maybe not currently scientifically measurable, is absolutely measurable through experience by anyone who's ever had or spent any amount of time with any other sentient living being that was non-human. So the other pretty crazy thing that has happened throughout many, many cultures is that witches and occultists and pagans will form these kinds of relationships, friendships, and even marriages with beings that aren't physical, but that are either intellectual entities. They can call them angels, you can call them, they go by a lot of different names. People will call them dragons, and they will form a sentient relationship where the witch or practitioner receives data and information from this other seemingly supernatural intelligence. And the individuals who perform these practices will have very intimate friendships with these intelligences, which are extremely taboo. If you talk about having conversations with something in your head, you are crazy. Correct or incorrect? The action of human beings having conversations of entities inside their head extends far into antiquity. And instead of being considered a mental illness, it was actually called a gift. And more importantly, was the source of the predominant forms that came to be the knowledge that makes our civilizations. Things like language, agriculture, music, mathematics, all were received from human beings coming into conversations with these kinds of intellectual, familiar spirits who are sometimes called angels, daemons, entities. There's a lot of different names for them in different cultures. One of the most famous ones that was very, very well documented was Socrates. How many of you guys have heard of Socrates' daemon? How many of you guys are aware that he was murdered because he had a daemon that he would talk to in his head? This is correct. So, how many of you guys think Socrates was pretty smart? Figured out a few things about some things. Socrates said that he got all of that information from his daemon and his guiding entity and guardian, right? And this is only one example. And the stigma that went along with that was so rampant and continues today that the keeping of a familiar spirit by a witch, I still get flack for it. The most harassment I get is from Christians, which, as I point out in my book, Christianity says that if a witch has a familiar spirit, she's to be put to death. Those words are actually in the Bible. Are any of you guys familiar with that phrase in the Bible that you shall not suffer a witch to live? That was due to the keeping of familiar spirits. How many of you guys are aware of the Holy Spirit? It's a familiar spirit, which takes the form of an animal, which is a dove. So, how many of you guys are aware that Mary had a sexual relationship with the Holy Spirit that then gave forth a progeny of a child who was known as Jesus Christ? Right, you guys familiar with this story? It's a pretty popular story. A lot of people tell this story all the time, right? I've heard this story a few times around the block. However, if a witch was known to have one of these marriage relationships with a familiar spirit, which many of them did, one of the most famous ones was Isis. Are you guys familiar with the story of Isis at all? This is from the Egyptian mythology. So it's pretty similar, actually, to the story of Mary and her relationship with the Holy Spirit. So Isis has sexual relationship with these entities that she, called angels. A lot of times they're identified as angels. And a lot of the Jewish Hebraic traditions identify the entities that Isis came into contact as very specific angels. And so much so that they have these wards or guards or like amulets to protect you from those particular angels that came down and had sex with Isis. So they actually name them by name. So not only are they recognizing that that did in fact occur, but they even have identities affiliated with them. So this is something that isn't really news because it's been around for a minute. But those beings that she came into relationship with gave her the information and data which then led to the entire Egyptian civilization. Construction of building, irrigation, agriculture, music, culture, all of these things, right? So, but anyone who practiced those pagan practices that were laid down like Isis, like I said, by the Christians, were murdered. Although the story of the existence of Jesus Christ was pretty much the exact same situation, from my understanding. Although I'm sure many people would argue that that was a special situation and that there's no way that that's the same thing, right? This is where I get into a lot of heated debates, because that is way different and nothing at all like it the same, right? Agree or disagree, right? So the explorations that I took into these investigations of not only where human beings come from, but how we come to accumulate knowledge, how we know what we know. How do you know what's true? How do you know information that you get? How do you get ideas? How did you figure out blah de blah. How did you create that song, right? Any of you guys creators? Any of you guys creative people here? When you go into that creative moment, how does it feel when that enters into you? Do you feel like it came from you? Oh, very interesting, isn't it? This is where we get the idea of the muse, which very closely imitates and relates to the stories of the daemons and the familiar spirits, which isn't to negate the human potential or to say that we can't come up with things, but rather to say that we seem to have some kind of relationship with informing sources, whether they're, some people might say that it's your higher self, which is granting you these kinds of communications. But your higher self in a lot of the older traditions is almost entirely identified as your daemon, right? Or your guiding spirit, which is basically sharing a sentience with you, kind of like your pet cat. A little similar to that type of relationship, right? If you look at some of the occultists talking about it, I go into some of the stories of Aleister Crowley. How many of you guys are familiar with Aleister Crowley? Have you heard of what he called the HGA? The Holy Guardian Angel? So Crowley claims to have gotten all of his data and information from his HGA. What's that? Yes, correct. So for him in particular, he puts a great emphasis on forming and coming into a relationship with your familiar spirit, and that is actually the source of all of your knowledge, and where you are able to come into and gain creativity, important data, knowledge of danger. For Socrates, for example, he said that anytime he was entering a dangerous situation, his daemon would literally yell at him, stop. So they, throughout indigenous cultures, are highly recognized as protective spirits, and a lot of times they're called guardians, which is where, of course, we get the term guardian angel, is from human beings having interactions of these kinds that are impossible that they would know of some dangerous event going to happen, and yet they were informed of it, right? Impossible, and yet it occurs fairly frequently throughout history in very well documented events for people who have relationships with these kinds of entities and beings. So that's kind of the short story or Cliff's Notes of the 2 volumes. Which I go into a lot more detail. But if any, I would like to open and see if you guys have any questions or quandaries about any of this stuff. I put myself at your disposal. If there's any curiosities that you might have. And if you guys are creative people, your creativity will do much better if you are able to form a relationship with your muse in a kind of more purposeful manner, where you can engage in some of these techniques to amplify your ability to be receptive to it, right? It's really about being receptive. As soon as you think you know, the less it will be able to talk to you. Anybody have any questions? Yes.
I'm curious about the dragon, because I did read something a while ago about dragons and how they were kind of, I thought they were almost considered like gods or something like that.
Yep. So the question is about dragons and that they were considered gods. In a lot of religions, dragons are considered gods and divine beings, right? Divine sentiences, especially if you go all over Asia. You can see that in almost every, I talk about this actually in my upcoming book on the I Ching, which is called The Secret Language of Serpents, because all through Asia, any enlightened being or Buddha, like Siddhartha Buddha, they receive their information from a dragon, okay, without exception. And in India, they are called Nagas, or the Naga serpents. And so, like for Tibetan Buddhism, you guys know Tibetan Buddhism? So the current Dalai Lama wears this yellow hat. So they have all these different kinds of fancy hats. And the Dalai Lama wears a yellow one, which shows that he follows the teachings of Nagarjuna. So Nagarjuna was a fellow who came into enlightenment, and he tells stories of how he was instructed specifically by the dragons. So this is not only like a supposition, but it's actually the story of most of the active religions all over Asia as the source of their wisdom, right? So if you go into the Greek and Hermetic alchemical literature, I'm like, well, where does this come from? Okay, so I already told you guys I'm like trying to find where this stuff comes from. So this also in the I Ching book I talk about. For the alchemical material, we trace it back to Thoth, or Hermes is the name of the fellow. And according to him, he comes into a conversation with a giant dragon who is called Poimanders. In some of the Greek names, he has other names in Egypt as well. It gets tricky because every culture that you're going to come into contact with calls them by a different name, right? This is what gets annoying when you try to find anything out about an archetype, and every culture will think that it's their deity, but then you're like, wait, though, this is actually everywhere. So that's also like the difference between an indigenous specific being and an archetype, okay? So I would call a dragon an archetype because you're going to see it globally. It's not restricted. It doesn't have a denomination or belong to a country. It's literally universal, right? So when the ones that I find the most interest in are the universal ones that you see in every single culture, because I'm like, well, that's weird that everyone sees the same thing that isn't there. What's that? Right? So that's a dragon, is a perfect example of one of those universally not there things that's there. Right? This is the true focus of both of my books, is trying to discover universal things that are there but not there, right? So these are things that are interesting to me. So dragons as gods then creates quite a thing, right? So these dragons are coming and informing all of these individuals that are really kind of deified as these extremely knowledgeable human beings that have figured out everything. Would you agree, right? We have, they're like realized beings in essence, okay? And if you, because like for me, I'm like, okay, well, let's talk to these realized beings and find out, how do you know all this stuff? And if you talk to the realized beings, all the realized beings say from dragons. So the next thing you gotta do is like, what's a dragon? Right? Very interesting. So what does that mean? I can't claim to know. I know a lot of different people that will talk about them in different contexts. I know my spiritual teacher, Dr. Kelvin DeWolf, has a lot of, he's a Native American from the Mi'kmaq tribe and community. So he has a very specific interpretation of them as energy waves and electromagnetic, almost like a frequency, if that makes sense, right? So he sees them not only abstractly, but as something that has if it's electromagnetic, that has a physical presence, right? Anything that is a waveform, now you're talking about a physical density, right? Whether it's sound or light or whatever, if you've got one of those, you're talking action, right? So, which if something can have a communication with us, that means it's having some kind of interaction with the physical world, right? Which is the thing. So how do these supernatural entities come into a discourse or a relationship or, right, a communication with us? Unless it's through maybe like an electromagnetic something. Whether that's light or sound, I don't know, but that's one of my favorite kind of descriptions of them, is through electromagnetic, because it makes sense. Because otherwise it's like very abstract or imaginational when the data they're conveying is seemingly very real and applicable. Yeah.
So if they are electromagnetic beings, is there a way to train yourself to physically see those waves?
Yes. Which is weird, but also true. I've personally experienced that, but it's very difficult. Okay, so for me, with the practices I did were from Dr. DeWolf, which he shares on his website, Paradigm of Power, and they come from also cultures, okay? So these are very difficult techniques, and you'll hear them written about. In my book, I talk about how the Native Americans who practice them usually do it on a vision quest, okay? So for a vision quest, it's like labor, because you have to not eat, you have to not sleep, you have to kind of like come out of your physical sensations, right? So in order to come into a place where you can see and experience liminal things that are on these other frequencies that we can't usually perceive, you have to shift your entire perceptual abilities. So we take for granted a lot of the ways that we perceive things every day, okay? We have, my teacher calls them paradigms, right? So you think the world is this. So because of how our biological brains operate to keep us from sensing and seeing everything, because otherwise you're going to have a blowout, right? What if you could know and see everything at one time? Can you guys imagine that? I hope you guys all imagine that tonight when you're alone. What if you could see and know everything? Right? Try to do it. You all did it a little bit just now. Did you feel that? Okay, but if you can imagine such a drastic shift of your ability to perceive things, it's going to involve a lot of things. Number one, you have to drop thinking that you know what anything is. That means stop taking everything for granted. You think you know what that tree is? I promise you don't. You don't even know who that tree is. When you raise your perceptual state, you start to see, oh my God, that's alive, like George. This is the kind of intelligences I'm talking about, the pagans that come into relationships with familiar spirits are having, because they can sentiently feel these life forms as the individuals that they are. When you can do this, it's a little upsetting to your daily situation that we've been accustomed to anyway. But nonetheless, being able to feel the aliveness of everything in a way that is very transparent and real is what allows and permits you to perceive these other entities, sentiences, and life forms. You have to first be able to feel alive. Seems simple, but not so much anymore. How many of you guys felt your heartbeat today? How many of you guys are aware that you breathed? Surprisingly, that goes under the carpet a lot of the time, right? So shifting that perception and ability to reach those kind of states, you gotta like knock out some stuff. Having your belly full of food is also kind of like a dampener, because you have influences, right? So you become really sensitive to what things are influencing your perception. So not only things you think or ideas other people want you to think, like this is this way, no, it's this way. Well, just shut up for a second and feel what it is. Because it could be self-evident. Maybe you don't have to give me a description of George. I can just sit in front of George and I can feel George and I can feel that truth that's George, right? I don't have to read the book. You know, so feeling these sentient life forms is like that. It's another way of knowing things that we're not used to doing. We're used to consuming, right? There's a difference between consuming and receiving. So you have to get receptive. Nobody likes being receptive because it's a threat to what you think you got. You have to get empty to receive. Feeling empty feels like lack. Scary. No one wants to be hungry. So uncomfortable. So you have to get a little hungry, right? You gotta like get a little uncomfortable, and that's how you're gonna get that sensation, so that it's senses and perceptions. Some people have it automatically, right? So a lot of folks either just come in that way, or they're raised in environments where they haven't been forced to consume a lot of stuff, so they can just kind of do it. But all humans can do it, right? Where it's really like a lot of the consumption that is, I think, overcharging people's discernment abilities. Certainly engaging in technology will do that. But if you do these other practices, it doesn't need to. You can still exercise it like a muscle. Anybody. Everyone. It's not special. It's a human capacity. Right? I think everybody needs to do it.
Does meditation help with that?
Yes. You have to, that's the stilling of the mercury, right? The unicorn I was talking about. So a lot of in the alchemical material, emptying things, right? So you have to empty your mind of all these thinky thoughts. But the nature of mind is volatile, right? So Mercury, it wants to cling on things and hang on to things and have something that is like, that it's got. Like it wants to think it knows something. It gets really uncomfortable when it thinks it doesn't know. And to go back to Socrates, that was why Socrates was considered so wise, ironically. He had this situation where he got to go and meet the Oracle of Delphi, which I talk about the Oracle of Delphi in the Familiars book as well. So this practice of witches keeping familiars was kept for thousands of years by the oracles. And the Oracle of Delphi was one of the most famous one of these oracles for her accuracy and predictions. And guess who the familiar spirit of the Oracle of Delphi was? A dragon. Dun, dun, dun. It was a dragon that lived in a cave that was called Python. And this is where we get the word Python from. And the cave where she would go, where her familiar spirit of the dragon was called the Pythia. And you would go into her cave to talk to, not really to the oracle, you were talking to the dragon. And she was providing a gateway or a threshold to permit you to have audience with the wisdom serpent. And she underwent a lot of sacrifice of herself in many ways, physical, mental, spiritual sacrifices. Most of them were virgins and celibate, which I talk about the connection of celibacy, virgins, right? We talked about already the Virgin Mary, who had the relationship with the Holy Spirit. That's actually from the Vestal Virgins of Rome and the oracle tradition, where they would come into relationships with these dragons. So the Oracle of Delphi met with Socrates, and she asked Socrates a very important question, and she said, like, why do you think you're the smartest man in all the land? Like, why do people call you so wise? And he said, I don't know anything. And so the Oracle of Delphi said, oh my God, you are the wisest man. Because you know that you don't know, right? So as soon as you can achieve states of clearing your mind, of thinking anything, you come into this situation, which is in occultism and esoteric literature, is called the novice mind, or the fool, as it's represented in the tarot, right? So coming into this state is one of the preconditions to true knowing, because it's very simple. Logically, if you think you know the answer, how are you going to learn the answer? How are you going to put water in a cup that's full of milk? Right? Seems very logical, but it's very hard to do. So the stilling of your mind is the archetype of coming into novice mind, or being free from knowledge. It's almost better to know nothing at all than to fill your head with all this stuff, because then you have to work really hard at clearing all of that out, right? Like, I can read all these books and see what all these other people think, But actually, most of what that's doing is giving me influences and suggestions that are interfering with my ability to feel what's true, because I'm going to already attach to an image because some really smart people said that this was true, so that must be true. But that's not necessarily the best thing to do. Obviously, we don't want to be dum-dums and disregard people who are smart. This is also a mistake, right? This is how we perpetuate ignorance. But we also need to engage our own sense of knowing. We have to do both of those things. But if you can't get to unicorn, if you can't do the unicorn part, you're going to have difficulty talking to the dragon. Yeah, very hard. Takes a lot of work. The more you know, the harder it is. It's easier for kids, right? So hard. How many of you guys ever had like a new idea come in? Was it after you thought you knew something, or when you were totally like had a betrayal, or what you thought was real was like turned over, right? How many of you guys had a realization after a total betrayal? Right? This is important. Total betrayals. This is why every good musical album comes out of a breakup. This is scientific. It's because your entire idea of reality was shattered. This is an important component to knowing. Until you shatter your entire idea of what you think is true, you'll not be able to gain access to some of these perceptions. And this is, those of you guys that have experienced a breakup betrayal, very uncomfortable, right? Very uncomfortable. How many people are going to try to get that happening? So this is why not very many people pursue this path, because you go through breakup betrayal every day. And then you have to talk to everyone who's still hanging on to a perception of a reality that is incorrect. Well, you know differently, right? So it's like talking to liars. This is a lot of difficulty in holding on to truth. Most indigenous cultures know this feeling very well. If you can imagine how hard it is for you in a breakup, think of how difficult it is for Black people living in America. When they know what's true, but then everybody else says something different. Or Native Americans. Think about what Native Americans have to face every day when they have a knowledge of truth or what they know, and then they're confronted with other people that say something which is entirely incorrect according to their perspective. So this is why human beings have a very difficult time sorting through all of this mind garbage. But most of the ancient indigenous cultures had very good methodologies and techniques to try to prevent these kinds of things from happening, which are all essentially misperceptions of the mind, right? I mean, you guys can kind of say, like, most of the problems that we have with each other from the relationship level on up into nation states is kind of due to these sorts of occurrences, right? So if you can look at it on that larger scale as that kind of consciousness occurrence, I think the solution to it is going to be maybe on a consciousness situation where we can come into awareness that these are just faculties of the way that our minds operate, and if we can change that, we could probably prevent some of these ignorances from occurring, which is what the mythological beasts are trying to teach us, but we've lost the codes of what they were representing due to the cut and pasters representing the wrong ideas of them. For example, no offense, but if you watch Fantastic Beasts, there will be none of this information covered in that material. Not due to anybody's fault, but simply through unknowing. Right? Other questions? Yeah.
So, like, what would be the beginning steps to become familiar with a familiar?
That's a good question. So the question is, what are the beginning steps to become familiar with a familiar? So, like I said, the vision quests are a little gnarly and require quite a bit of work. But you can, through being receptive and just feeling things, we can practice feeling things. So it's good, you can start with people. Instead of thinking you know somebody, like we take ourselves for granted, Like if you have a friend, you think, oh, that's this person, and they're that person, and that's them, right? So you get like a little schemata, or I like that song by The Cure, Pictures of You, right? So you get this like identity of them, and then you kind of stop paying attention as you come into confrontation with them all the time. This is taking someone for granted. But if you keep your feelers open as you're in front of people, you can feel them. You can still feel every day. So you can feel them, and you don't need to, it's like a different kind of communication. So the best way to start coming into the reception of the familiars is come back into your animal instincts, which have to do with feeling and reception and senses, right? You can smell things. You can really look at things. Don't just like pass it in a glance, right? And think you know what that thing is. Really look at that thing. You have to like be a scientist. Right? Pretend like you don't know. And just feel it out. So that's a daily practice that you can do. Just everywhere you go, you can see someone and kind of feel them. We're surprisingly transparent. Shockingly transparent. If someone has something going on, you can actually feel it pretty clear. And even all the way through the timeline of what their intention is going to be. We try to deaden that. This might be a good thing if we knew that much about each other. I don't know, man. Going to a grocery store is kind of a lot, right? So, but if you practice just coming into your senses and perceptions and feeling things, that goes a really long way. And that helps in all of this. And then that helps discern truth, too. As soon as you start doing that, you're going to feel, right? Whenever my guts are so loud... Even when people are lying, they growl like an animal. Like, it's crazy. Your physical body knows. Even if you're checked out, your actual physical body is paying attention. Whether or not you know. Like, you may have stopped paying attention a long time ago, but your body's like, hey, hey, hey. So, feel your physical. Like, what are you feeling when you stand in front of someone, too? Like, where in your body are you feeling it? This is like, we don't usually do that, right? We don't have that kind of body awareness where we'll place ourselves in because we're looking out at the person or listening to the words they say, and we take the words for granted, right? Best way to tell if someone's lying, you can feel it. They can say something, but that doesn't really matter. Sadly, it's not that what they say isn't the most important part, right? Doesn't matter. We all lie all the time, but you are yourself no matter what you say. What you say doesn't affect what you are and what you're doing. This is the illusion of people think like words have power, but this is like a big thing. I don't know if you guys like know about the magic world or the new age world, but they always say like the word is the thing, but there's a thing that the word is born from, right? So there's logos. They call it logos. This is in religion, too, the world is words and logos, but the logos is born from eros. So eros is the first, before the word. Eros is the desire to speak. So you can tell someone's desire, and their word doesn't matter, right? So you go back to the source of where what they're saying is coming from, and that's the better way, because you feel what their nature is. And then you'll feel all these things. Kind of cuts out the middleman a little bit, right? I could say anything. People do. They'll say all kinds of things. How do you know what's true? This is what we're really going to get confronted with. I'm telling you, like, the whole revolution of a lot of the technology is going to present us all with these dilemmas where we're going to have to discern what's true. So the more people get back at practicing and feeling truth and rooting that, we're not going to have these catastrophes of I call it like the War of the Worlds, right? People are suckers. You get caught up in the drama and they can't see through it, right? What else? We probably have time for one more. If anybody has anything else? Yes.
Can you talk about belly talkers? Was that?
Oh, belly talkers is so good. Yeah, so in the book also, one of the words that I came across when I was researching the oldie schooly witches that do these practices is the gastroentoimoi, which is a Greek word, which means belly talker. And it's actually where they get the word ventriloquist from, which means to speak from your belly, but it originally meant to speak from your womb or have your womb be talking or speaking, almost like as if it was a puppet. And so the belly talkers was the original old word for the oracles. So like I mentioned with the Oracle of Delphi, this was a very long tradition of diviners or a divination form. And it's actually where a lot of divination came from, was from this tradition, which they, of course, murdered all of the oracles. I know it's the same story as the cats. It's all so tragic and stupid. But the belly talkers were also the Vestal Virgins of Rome, which I don't know if you guys know, but Rome, for centuries, the Vestal Virgins was a bunch of women who chose not to get married, and they lived kind of sequestered, and they made all of the ruling decisions of the city. And they were sponsored by the city, they were paid for by the city, they were cherished as sacred, and they were part of the government of Rome for a very long time, until the Christian emperors came in and they said no more priestesses allowed. So that was also the dividing line, where that was the end of priestesses and women being permitted to lead religions. So now, how many of you guys know religions where women are allowed to be priests? What? I didn't hear you. What? Oh, it's none. Of course, now, because they fought, there's like some rabbis where they permit women to be, but it's only in certain sects, because of course you can't have any women in charge of any religion. You guys think that's weird? What do you guys think about that? I don't know, it's kind of weird if you ask me, like, why did that happen? We can see exactly, precisely the point in history where it happens, which is when the Catholic Church of Rome takes over and they literally murdered all of the priestesses. So it's not like rocket science trying to get to the bottom of that source. But it happened nonetheless. So the belly talkers is describing a multicultural, this happened in many different countries, so it was not restricted to Rome, which mostly just copied other countries, really. Most of the Roman and Greek traditions were pretty much stolen from Africa, really, because they came into Alexandria, right, and just were like, wow, this is really good stuff. Let's just take from that, right? Which, of course, is what ended up happening to Africa from still going on, as Mali is raped of all of its nuclear resources, and certainly so many others. But so the Romans were only one group of people who used these practices. It was, most of the people placed it to its origin, and in my book I discuss how it seems to have arisen in Turkey or Anatolia, specifically Mount Ida, where the women would make these sacrifices with their bodies, and the dragons or familiar spirits would speak through them, through literally parts of their physical body, where the entity or deity would kind of live, like they had a house in their body for the familiar spirit to reside. So that belly talker. And the idea of a ventriloquist is like to throw your voice, and a lot of the belly talkers were known to speak inside of people's heads, Like in Lord of the Rings, you guys know where the elf queen throws her voice? She's a ventriloquist, right? Because she can throw her thoughts right up into you without any barrier. You can really do it when you do these practices. It's not as exciting in other people's brains as you might think it is. But nonetheless, it's a capacity. So you can ventriloquist your thoughts because human beings have a capacity for telepathy through connection. So like, for example, if you guys have, and this goes back to the family or familiars, when you become familiar with someone, they're your friends. How many of you guys have been hanging out with your friends and you guys think the same thought or say the same word, right? I've had some of my super tight friends, right, will say an entire sentence at the exact same time. Like ridiculous, like an entire sentence of words. And one of them was witnessed by another person, and it was like, what is happening right now? Like, it's impossible. It's completely impossible, except that both of us were connected on that trajectory, right? Or you'll have a friend, like it happens a lot with friends and other times with family members that you're really close to. My little sister and I notoriously do it constantly. We used to have fun and do like a track record of how many times it would happen, especially when we lived next to each other. But we would literally identically say the same thing at the same moment, predictably, like on a cycle. So being able to have familiar relationships where you have a connection to someone or an animal, you come into a kind of understanding, right? This is an ability that human beings have when we drop our guards or protective layers of fear, that our hearts are, our houses of our hearts are usually shielded out of fear due to lack of trust, because we can't feel what's true, right? So if you can't feel what's true, how do you know? If you don't know, you better protect yourself, right? So most of us engage with people in a guarded manner so that we can't penetrate to have those kinds of connections. You're missing out on a lot. But you're real safe though. You got real safe. Okay, well thanks you guys for listening. They have the books available up at the counter, and they're also, if you wanted to get one later, they're on Amazon and all the interwebby things. And my website is witchofthedawn.com. I give other talks and lectures around town and events periodically. Thanks for all the questions.